I'll get us started today. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Community Mental Health, Drug and Alcohol Research Network's workshop on ethics and lived experience in research. My name's Katie Sam, and I'm the project coordinator for CMHDARN, and I'll begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands of which we're all variously meeting. Today, I'm situated on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations participants today. And I'd also like to recognise all those with lived experience of mental health conditions or substance use and their important contributions to informing policy and service reform, particularly through research and evaluation. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. There's been really great interest in this workshop, and I hope that everyone walks away with something practical today. We've set it up to be more of a workshop style so that you can easily have your questions and queries answered in a more interactive and engaging way. So before I hand over the reins to the wonderful Jo Farmer, I encourage you all to please use the chat function throughout the session. Raise your little emoji hand. Jo's eager to answer all of your burning questions, so please don't be shy and just try and keep yourself muted if you're not wanting to engage with the group. We're due to finish at 3 o'clock today, and this workshop is being recorded for you to access later if you're unable to stay for the whole event. If people aren't comfortable with having the interactive Q&A part recorded, just let me know in the chat and I can pause the recording part. I believe that's all the boring housekeeping done. So I'm delighted now to introduce our fantastic host, Jo Farmer. So Jo's an independent evaluator and advocate working in the mental health and trauma sectors. As well as delivering evaluations directly, she is passionate about supporting organisations to develop robust evaluation and monitoring systems with people with lived experience at the centre. She has her own lived experience of mental ill health, trauma and suicidality. And in addition to her evaluation practice, Jo is undertaking a PhD at the University of Melbourne, focused on involving young people with experiences of trauma in research. So thank you very much, Jo, for bringing your expertise to CMHDARN today.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks for having me. This is my second time presenting at CMHDARN, and kind of came about because after I presented last time, got chatting to Katie about my interests and the things that I'm really passionate about. And I think I might be one of the only people in the world who's interested in ethics and ethics processes and how you get research through that. And I'm really quite nerdy about that, having as Katie mentioned, my own lived experience and having been involved in research, both as the conductor and commissioner of research, but also as a research participant, and really thinking about how can we make that process better for everyone that's involved. And so, yeah, that's led me to my interest in this particular little niche of working with people with lived experience in research, and the whole process of doing that in an ethical way, and then navigating some of those formal kind of ethics processes that are associated with that. So I do have some slides that I'm going to bring up now, and hopefully with the magic of technology that all works. Great. I hope everyone can see that now. So I'll just fix that so I can see everything on my Star Trek style multiple screen situation. I'd also like to, before I go any further, acknowledge that I'm joining today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Yeah, just acknowledge that it's really important when doing this kind of work that we pay the acknowledgements to the land that we're working on, given the ongoing impact of colonisation on the mental health and well-being of Aboriginal people and the land that we live on. As Katie mentioned, I'm going to speak for a bit, but my goal is to try and keep that relatively short, to cover a few main points, and then to have time for us to talk in a bit more detail. I'm aware that this is an area where people probably have their own practice examples of, this is something that we tried to do and it didn't work, or this is something we did and it worked really well, or this is a challenge that I am facing in the upcoming time. And I wanted to give people space to talk about those things. And I'm sure with the makeup of the group that's here, there's also a lot of wisdom in the group and people who've tried different things, different approaches. So I want to make sure that we have time to, rather than just listen to me give a presentation, actually have some of that discussion and solve some problems, and hope everyone leaves here with some of that practical guidance. But I'll get into saying my piece first, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion afterwards. In the meantime, if there is anything that you want to ask, as Katie said, just pop it in the chat, and we'll lead off with that when we get to that discussion section. This feels like a fairly obvious point to start with in a presentation about lived experience participation in research. But I think it's important to emphasize this point. When it comes to the ethical design of research, what that actually means is designing research that balances the benefits of doing that research, and that might be individual benefits, but it's more likely in the context of the kind of work that most of the group do that it's kind of social benefits or service benefits. So balancing those benefits with the potential risks or harms that happen through research. My experience has been, and I'm sure some of you might have a similar experience, that those harms are well scrutinized when designing research and going through formal ethics approval and that kind of process, and often in a way that might present quite high barriers to cross in order to support people with lived experience to participate in research safely. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I think it is important to consider where the research actually lies on whether people can participate safely. And it's also worth noting that this is in the context of the National Statement on Ethical Human Research, which does say that people who experience a mental illness are at higher vulnerability to harm from research. So with all of that context in mind, I think it's important to say that, yes, actually people with lived experience can participate in research safely. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by participate in the next slide. But this is particularly from the point of view of people who are participating as research subjects, so collecting their information through surveys or interviews or other ways that people share their experiences. Several research studies have found that it's not a distressing experience for most people, and that where distress does occur, it's usually not extreme and it's typically short-lived. And the flip side of thinking about distress is that often participation in research can actually lead to positive benefits. So things like people feeling like they've had a chance to have their say, feel listened to, contribute to something bigger than them. Those are some kind of benefits that people can get from participating in research. That said, there is some evidence that suggests that people who have a lived experience, typically a lot of the research that I've looked at has been more from a trauma than an explicitly mental health or drug and alcohol kind of lens, but obviously we all know there's a huge amount of overlap between those groups, has found that a history of trauma does lead to a potentially higher risk of experiencing harm through research. So it's really important to design safe and ethical research. The whole concept of my PhD is looking at this idea of harm, and I could easily talk for multiple hours about that, but I won't. But what that suggests is harms are actually quite poorly defined. And so the ways that you understand the potential harms that can happen through research and how you might mitigate them is to work in collaboration with people with lived experience in designing and developing the research, to understand the context that you're doing the research in and the strengths that people bring. And not just assuming that vulnerability, as is outlined, I mentioned before, in the national statement, working from a position of strengths, and how can we use those strengths to involve people in research in a way that's going to not just mitigate harm, but actively benefit people. And that's generally my lens when I think about this is harm minimization, harm mitigation is good, but that should be the bare minimum for us as researchers. We actually want to make the research process rewarding and valuable for people who are participating. So what do I mean when I say research participation? This is a version of a diagram that comes from some other work I've done on evaluation, so that's why it's got a slight evaluation lens to it, but broadly stands. Traditionally, when we've talked about involving people with lived experience in research, we've tended to stick around that blue box there. So it's participants being involved as data subjects, as I mentioned before, so providing their information through a variety of data collection techniques. I would argue, and I think it's increasingly becoming accepted, that there is scope to involve people with lived experience right along the research process, from coming up with the research questions and the methods and how you're going to investigate whatever it is that you're going to investigate, collecting data, as I mentioned before, then involving people with lived experience in analysing and interpreting that data, and finally, people with lived experience playing a really key role in reporting data, contributing to the best ways of reporting data, understanding that maybe journal articles and 100-page government research reports are not the best ways of communicating to the community about what research has found, and then being really involved in the dissemination of whatever is found from research. Hopefully I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, given that you've chosen to come along to this particular webinar, but I think it's always important to mention the value of involving people with lived experience. So this is, again, along that whole continuum of involving people in research. There's just a kind of general value and kind of moral principle, I think, that it's important to be hearing lived experience perspectives when we are doing work that's meant to improve their lives and the services that they receive. But there's also kind of practical and instrumental value in involving people with lived experience too. So it's about asking the right questions in the right way. It can be about building safety and comfort for participants. And I often think in the work that I've done, I can think really clearly of an example of a time when I was talking to somebody about their experiences of suicidality. And I could tell that the way they were talking to me was really quite guarded, and they were sharing things in a particular way that was like, I don't want you to judge me. I don't want you to overreact and panic and call emergency services if I disclose that, that suicide has ever been something that I've thought of, and really kind of moderating the way that they used language, and was kind of physically holding that in themselves. They didn't look comfortable in how they were interacting. And at that point, I kind of gently introduced into the conversation that I was somebody who'd also experienced suicidal thoughts and behaviors in the past before, and it just completely changed the tone of the conversation we're having. That tension kind of evaporated out of it. And I'm not saying that it's not possible for somebody who doesn't have that lived experience to establish that rapport, but it definitely built that bridge, I think, a bit quicker. And when you're doing research and you often don't have time to establish a long-term relationship with that person like you might do if you were a service provider, anything that you can do to build those bridges and build rapport is a win for the participant, and it's a win for the research. There's also a strength in being able to kind of deeply understand the participant experience and what people are sharing. And in particular, that kind of translation component of hearing what somebody's saying and really deeply understanding the meaning behind the words that they're trying to use and the concepts that they're trying to communicate in the way that they are sharing what they experience. I won't spend too long on this because I do want to get onto the kind of more ethics focused stuff. But I do think when thinking about involving people with lived experience through that research process, it's unavoidable to talk about power, and that's something that you should be thinking about when you're doing this work well. This is just one model of thinking about power. There are as many models for thinking about power as there are words in the dictionary. So I have found this one particularly helpful, and thinking from that ethics and research design perspective of how have we challenged our own power as researchers, and how have we sought opportunities to cede some of that power to people with lived experience. So I'll just quickly explain what some of these mean and give you a bit more concrete illustration. But privilege, that's probably one that we're most familiar with. That's the kind of privilege that's associated with your power from social groups, your race, your gender, your location, all of those things will feed into that power. And again, if you're designing good ethical research, you should be thinking about ways about building different perspectives and different levels of privilege into your research team, into the subjects that you speak to as part of the research, and also thinking about how you interpret the findings that you have from that research, because having those diverse voices and levels of privilege is going to interpret the information that you hear quite differently. Access is about the power to influence who is included in the process. So when we say people with lived experience are involved in the process, who's deciding which people with lived experience those are, and how they're involved? Are you having a lived experience led team, or is it a couple of project advisors you might have who might not actually have a huge amount of day-to-day influence or say over how the project is run? So it's just really thinking about where and when people with lived experience are involved in that process and what's happening. The power to influence decisions, that comes right back to that. I mean, it's throughout the process, but really particularly at the start of that research process. Who is getting to decide the research questions that are asked, and the ways that they're answered, but also thinking about when it comes to the synthesis of research. I think in qualitative research, we often talk about the themes emerging. And themes just don't emerge. You don't just bring the data to the table and they magically in a cloud come up to you and go, we are the themes. There is an active process of interpretation that happens through that. So it's really important to consider who's involved in that process. We've got role power, and that's about the power that comes from both the kind of formal roles that you have, but also then how you use that power in a group. One thing that I do if I've got a group together for the first time when we're trying to think of, there's different perspectives there, might be lived experience, might be some system roles, is get people to introduce themselves without their role title. And it's really interesting that it's often the people who have the most senior role titles are the most reluctant to step away from sharing those in the room, because they know they come with power to share in that space. I think it's really important when you're designing research teams, we have roles in the system that are associated with power. I've had, we might talk about this as an example, but an ethics committee that's questioned the fact that everyone on the team is positioned as a lived experience researcher, and there was nobody in that team who had completed a PhD and nobody in the team who had a clinical qualification, and that was called out as a potential risk to the project, even though it was an evaluation of a lived experience program by a lived experience organization. So it would have been odd from our perspective to add a clinician into that context. But that was a really clear example of where there was power that was associated with the roles, and that was being valued differently depending on who was reviewing that and the way those roles were being used. And the final one there is the power to influence how stakeholders work. Again, I'm thinking about things like having lived experience advisory groups, which can be really beneficial. But how is that power being used and fed into the process? What are the terms of reference for those groups? Who has determined how those terms of references are formed and what they include, and the pathways to influence through that? So again, this is a topic that I could talk about for much longer than the time we've got together. But I guess the central message that I want you to take away from this is, whenever you're designing research, whenever you're thinking about involving people with lived experience, it isn't enough to just add a couple of lived experience researchers or add an advisory group without considering any of the structural factors that contribute to how that those people have a say in the project. So I encourage you to find a power framework or something like that that works for you, that helps you work through the different ways that people can influence the project that you're designing. So what can you do to support ethical engagement with and by people with lived experience based on some of these things? The first one, again, I hope by this stage, even though we've not been together long, this is already a theme. It's about identifying opportunities to involve people with lived experience throughout the process, not just as data subjects, and recognize the experience that they bring and giving them power throughout that research process wherever possible. Recognizing the varied skills and experience that researchers with lived experience bring, and that's often not a linear career trajectory, and so people might not necessarily have the other kind of markers of experience that you might be looking for with other kinds of researcher. But that's also to say not to discount those two. I was actually just in a webinar before stepping into this webinar, which was about family violence victim survivors being involved in research. And one of the participants on that panel was talking very eloquently about how the more she shared her lived experience as a victim survivor of family violence, the less people were able to see the other skills and experience that she was also bringing to that research. And she, got pigeonholed as a lived experience person and not actually as a very capable and experienced policy practitioner. So it's about recognizing those different skills. And as the next point says, they're really valuing them. Obviously, remuneration is a big one, and it is often a very practical point there, but it's about other kinds of recognition that you can give to people along the process, giving people autonomy, giving people chances to learn, finding other ways to recognize their work, having people as co-authors, giving them opportunities to present the research and be kind of actively involved in the dissemination of research so that they also get to own it. And I'm really interested in trauma-informed research, and one of the big parts of the principles behind that is these kind of ideas of reciprocity and empowerment. So if you can build those into your project, you're really supporting that experience to be more of a positive and a safe one for the people that you're involving in your research projects. And the last one there is developing lived experience research networks and their capacity and their capability. So that's about recognizing people who might be earlier on that research career trajectory than your average researcher who steps into a role. I'm working on a project at the moment where we've explicitly recruited peer evaluators who don't have a lot of experience. And when we were doing the interviews, we were looking for examples of where people were using research skills, but not necessarily calling them research skills. So one of our peer researchers had a business admin job where previously it was her job to listen to the meetings and take the minutes. And I'm immediately like, that's a research skill, because you have to listen and you have to work out what's the key message that is being taken from probably, paragraphs of speech. What's the key thing that needs to be minuted there? So recognizing that capability and building it, and also the more call there is for this kind of work and doing work at research and evaluation in a lived experience involved and led way, the more lived experience researchers we need to have practically. And I know in Victoria, where I am, there's so much work at the moment coming out of the Royal Commission, and the lived experience researchers are all very tired because there aren't that many of us and we're being called on a lot. So if you're in a position where you can develop the capability of others, I'd really support you to do that. So I just wanted to flag some common ethical challenges. And at this stage, I would really encourage you to put some of the challenges that you face into the chat, because hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about some of these things. But in the meantime, here are some of the kind of common challenges that I experience, both in terms of research design anytime, but also I'm particularly thinking about how you go through formal approval processes like HREX and that kind of thing. The first one there is about capacity and consent. As I flagged before, the national statement assumes a kind of default higher vulnerability for people with mental health issues. And so often you're required to really detail how you would ensure that people have the capacity to consent to the research that they're participating in. My approach is to recognize that the national statement and human research ethics committees are one framework for establishing capacity and consent and that kind of thing, but we have other frameworks available to us too. For example, in Victoria, the Mental Health Act is really clear on how capacity is defined. And apologies, I'm not so familiar with the New South Wales legislation, but one of the things that I often say in my ethics applications is we'll be following the presumption of capacity that's enshrined into law, and we will only override that if we get clear signs that somebody can't meet that threshold, that they can't understand what we're saying, that they can't remember it, they're not able to use that to make a decision about their ability to participate, and they're not able to communicate that decision. Those are kind of all things that you should be doing in a consent process anyway to ensure that people have capacity to consent. But I just remind you that, yeah, there, as well as the kind of research of ethics frameworks, there are other frameworks available for you to be justifying the decisions that you make. When it comes to participant safety, there's a couple of things to consider. First of all is obviously the safety of participants that you're collecting data from. And I'd really encourage you to develop a safety protocol for research that you do, even if you're not having to go through an HREC, but really thinking through how are we going to set up research safely, how are we going to respond to issues if they arise, and how are we going to make sure that everybody leaves the research feeling at the bare minimum, not harmed by that process of being involved. And a little plug, on my website, there is a kind of draft skeleton of a safety protocol, if that's something you'd be interested in looking at, and then taking that and tailoring it to your project. It's also important when thinking about participant safety that you're also thinking about your own team's well-being as part of ethical research, and particularly thinking through what that might mean for researchers on your team with lived experience. Again, not assuming that they're more vulnerable than other staff members, but having processes in place for if there are challenges to your team's well-being. Something that often comes up is about involving peer workers in projects, either as proxies for consumers or community members with mental health challenges, or as researchers. I think it's really important to recognize the role that the peer worker is playing. Often they aren't a straight proxy for a community member because they are embedded in a service. Or a community organization, and that means they're likely to have a different perspective from your average community member and potentially face conflicts of interest if they're serving in that function. The other thing is to recognize that lived experience research is skilled, and while peer workers have heaps of skills, and many of those involve engaging one-on-one with program participants, they might not have research skills to be able to conduct research tasks. And so if you are going to give them opportunities, which I would absolutely encourage to get involved in research, make sure that they're supported to do that and they have access to this kind of skills development. They need to do that well. And the last challenge that often comes up is around remuneration. This is one where sometimes organizations and sometimes ethics committees view payment as an inducement or coercion to participate. In my experience, that's not what it is. It's about fairly recognizing that people have given their time to do something and they should be reimbursed for that, given that you as a researcher are gaining from their knowledge. There's a huge amount of variation out there about rates. My advice to you would be to find something that's kind of similar or justifiable in your jurisdiction, in your sector, and go from there. And also think about payment approaches. Often the temptation is to do a voucher And that might have a whole bunch of reasons. You might have organizational principles that mean that you can only do a voucher. Again, my general principle thinking about those kind of trauma-informed principles of choice is give people choice. Sometimes people actually want a voucher because if you pay them cash or something like that, they might be concerned about Centrelink entitlements or tax implications or that kind of thing, even though it isn't that clear-cut. But most of the time I find that people want to be able to have the freedom to use money however they want. And so a Coles voucher might not be how they want to spend. They might not want to shop at Coles. So giving them that is not necessarily helpful. So find ways to give people choice about the reimbursement that you give them. The last thing I'm going to talk about, because I appreciate I've gone over 20 minutes in my little chat, and that was always going to be inevitable because I don't shut up, is how to engage with HRECs on these issues. I think there's often a fear of human research ethics committees. They're quite bureaucratic institutions. They often have endlessly unwieldy forms that are different from ethics committee to ethics committee, so it's hard to have template responses and that kind of thing. But there are ways to work with them constructively. The first one there is to build good relationships with the committee that you're working with. That seems kind of obvious, but it's really important. And if you build a good relationship with the Secretariat from the outset, that can save you a world of pain down the track. That means that they can give you a heads up on how things might be received at the ethics committee. They can help you make changes more quickly to your application. And they have a really good knowledge of how that group of members of the ethics committee typically view projects similar to yours, so can be really good at guessing ahead of some of the issues that might be raised. I had one recently where the Secretariat was very aware that the last 3 projects had all received a lot of scrutiny around the capacity assessment to participate in the research. And so I made sure that when I submitted that ethics application, it had like twice as much as I would usually write on capacity and consent, but that bit didn't get questioned at all because I was kind of forewarned and forearmed to deal with that. The other thing is also to view what you're doing in an ethics application slightly as an education opportunity to the HREC. Often, there's an assumption that they are experts in research and experts in ethical research design. And while that might be true, they might not be experts in the context in which you're working, in the services that you're working in, and the kinds of clients or consumers that you're working with. So educate them about the context that you're working in, provide evidence, provide links to research papers that say, we've chosen this minimum age of participation to align with other studies that are similar in this context. Set those precedents. So the example I mentioned before of using the legal precedent of how capacity is defined in the law and saying that you're using that same precedent in your application. So while often ethics application forms are just going through and answering questions, bear in mind that it's also presenting an argument as well as purely answering the questions. And the last thing is often you'll get comments that you don't agree with, and your initial reaction is, how can they have written this? They really don't understand what we're trying to do. And I would say challenge that. If there's something that sometimes you'll get a comment that's like, could you add this line into participant information sheet? And you go, yeah, sure, that's a good idea. We'll add that in. But sometimes the challenges are more fundamental and change the ways that you want to do things. And often by the time you've got to the stage of having a research protocol, you've really thought through these things and you have a strong rationale for why. So present that back to the committee and do it constructively. As I mentioned before, provide the context, provide the evidence. And again, this ties into the first point of get the Secretariat on side, because they're going to be there. They're going to be your conduit for going back to that ethics committee and explaining why that decision's been made. So if they really understand why you've made a particular choice, you're much more likely for them to be able to make that decision without having to have a pinging, time wasting back and forth between you and the chair. So that's everything I was going to say. We have got some time for some questions now. I don't think there's any in the chat so far. But I'm really keen to understand, yeah, just some of the skills and experience that are in the room at the moment. How do you currently work with people with lived experience on your projects, and how do you manage some of these challenges? But Kate, you've got your hand up.
Hi, Joe. Thank you for that. And you and I should nerd out sometime about about HREC and lived experience research. So I'm doing some research that is autoethnography and lived experience research. And one of the challenges that I'm finding with the ethics processes is that when you submit an ethics application, it actually has to be a really solidly designed, constructed kind of document. But if co-design and collaboration is actually part of the research method, it's really difficult to engage with lived experience researchers, particularly where, you know, like I'm in a permanent academic job, that's okay, I'm getting paid, you know, whatever I'm doing. But yeah, I find it's really difficult to kind of fit the authentic collaborative decision making that should happen from the very, very start, with the ethics process that kind of says before you even engage with people, you should know this. I'm like, no, the engagement. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. And this is a challenge I face all the time. I'd love to nerd out with you because I've got an autoethnographic lived experience component in my PhD, and I'm trying to work out how I flesh that out in a way that is compelling to an ethics committee and to PhD examiners and that kind of thing. So that's separately interesting. I think to go to your question, there's a few different things that occur to me. The first is whether an ethics application is actually needed. It sounds like you work maybe at a university, and so that probably makes your life harder in this respect, because universities often have a default requirement for that.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but what I would just say to everybody who doesn't work at a university is often consider whether you do need an ethics application. You really only have to do it if you're working in a university, or if your funder requires you to do it for some other reason. But there are other ways that you can work around, not that you should be working around, you should still be being ethical. But there are things that you should consider about whether you actually need that, whether it counts as evaluation, and whether an internal review process would provide that scrutiny. But to get to your question, the other way that I do that is basically just to, as I said before, play that educative role with the ethics committees and say, we are giving you something that's vague because of these reasons. Even though it's vague, the bits that actually matter to you, the capacity to participate, the safety of participants, those are the things that we've thought about. We haven't thought about the methodology so much, but whatever we do, people are going to be safe while we do it. I think the other thing that you raised there is a practical challenge of how do you keep people engaged when timelines are both very rigid, but also move a lot. It's a problem I've had recently on a project that is explicitly lived experience led, that's got a bunch of peer evaluators on it who it's a relatively small project, so there was no way that we could feasibly hire them full-time. I'm not full-time on the project either, but the project's then been delayed by 8 months. So these are people who need to go and find other work, which is entirely fair. I think there are things that you can do to keep people engaged during that time, and finding other tasks that people can work on, which I'm sure has occurred to you. But I think this also speaks to the broader point of developing lived experience research capacity in the sector, because it means you're not putting all of your hopes on one or two researchers that absolutely have to stay involved, otherwise the project falls apart. if you've got a bigger pool to pick from and more networks to draw on, if somebody has to drop out because the timeline's changed and they need to take a job, then there's somebody else that you can pick up and work with. Yeah, essentially I'm doing my PhD because of the very frustration that you've expressed, and I want to try and find some more practical ways of managing it because it's difficult. Yeah.
Thanks, Jo. I'll make sure I follow up with you offline.
Be great. Any other reflections or questions? Anna.
Hi, Jo. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, all good.
Okay. My name's Anna. I'm a researcher at the University of Wollongong. We've got a couple of lived experience projects going on, a couple of co-production projects. So thanks very much for your talk, by the way. It's really, really good. What I wanted to ask about was just to hear a little bit more from you about your wellbeing plans and around how you set up things that are going to keep all members of the team safe, and what you kind of include in those. So in our ethics application, we were asked to consider that as well, which we hadn't put in our original application. So I wondered if you had any insights around what should go in that sort of plan.
Yeah. So on a practical level, I do like a wellbeing induction session as part of project onboarding for my teams. And so we can also then say in the ethics application, all of our teams have had it's in this case a 1 hour induction session. My first main principle of that is that most people are best placed to understand their own well-being, and particularly when you're working with people with lived experience who've been managing mental health challenges or whatever it might be for often decades. Sometimes I think it's kind of insulting for an ethics committee or a research to be like, I know how you can stay well. So the way I tend to approach it is to encourage people to think about those strengths that they have. As part of that initial induction, I get people to, it's not really a well-being plan as such, but to think about their coping strategies and approaches that they use, and to think about different kinds of coping strategies. When we say self-care, we often think bubble baths and treats and cakes and that kind of thing, but those are good, but they're not all that needs to be in there. And in particular, I encourage people to think about well-being having the things that will help them wind down at the end of the day, but also what are the things that people can do on the fly if they get distressed during an interview, hearing somebody's story. Is there like a grounding exercise or something that they can just do in the moment to help be well? So there's the kind of well-being plan bit of it, if you want to call it that. But then the other things that I make sure that get built into the stuff that would also go to the ethics application would be making really clear what supports are available in the project. And generally, as a rule, if I've got supports that are available to participants in the project, they'll also be available to members of the research team. So I'm doing a big family violence project at the moment where we've got specialist family violence workers for debriefing participants, but they've also been available from day one for any of the peer evaluators with lived experience to also talk with them. And then also making really clear about your practices around briefings, around debriefings, around support, supervision, and just documenting all of that. It's as much not what you actually say, but demonstrating that you've thought about it, that I think ethics committees are wanting to see. Yeah. Does that answer?
That's really helpful. Thanks, Jo.
Thanks. John.
Hi, Jo. I've really found this presentation really quite useful. I'm an AD health services planner, and we've been involved in a number of projects directly involving consumers, and with the aim of elevating the consumer voice and incorporating their views in the broader treatment planning process. And I guess I just want to have a chat a bit about capacity. That's something that's really been a key issue for us. I guess since the release of the report into the Royal Commission into Mental Health, there's a lot of goodwill and there's increased recognition and broad-based support for doing what we can do to embed consumer participation, but we're really hamstrung, we're really held back. And whilst there's broad-based support, there isn't anywhere near enough when it comes to making sure that there's the resources and infrastructure and systems in place to make sure that this sort of activity is sustainable. And I guess as I was hearing what you're talking about and reflecting on what could happen, I guess some of the challenges that we've got is around capacity in terms of, for example, we brought in some consumers to operate as peer researchers for the past few years. And since that time, they've all, many of them have gained employment and sort of have got multiple commitments. So trying to recruit people and having them available is a challenge. And secondly, the other thing I was actually thinking about was the issue around seating power and control. And sort of we're a few years down the track now, and we're in a very different situation, and sort of looking at how do we actually move forward in the various projects in a manner that actually really capitalises on the wisdom in the room. And for me, I want to become less of a gatekeeper. I want to step back as much as possible. I'm just wondering if you could sort of comment on some of those issues in terms of your experience.
Yeah. I don't have a silver bullet for you, because those are probably the two things that frustrate me most on a daily basis. So it seems relevant that you would be having those two. I think with recruitment, I think also I work for myself. A real focus of the work that I've been trying to do in the last couple of years is to develop people and take people on as RAs on research projects and build them up. And I've also had a similar challenge of a lot of the people who, you invest time and capacity in, who then go on and get other jobs. And that's great. That's why you do it. But yeah, it does mean that there's these kind of systemic recruitment issues. I don't think there's an easy answer, because I do think it's a systemic issue. I'm trying to, part of the reason doing these kind of presentations is raise awareness of basically if the sector and governments are going to increasingly require lived experience involvement in basically every project, they also have to be coming to the table on supporting the development of capacity within the sector. And so really making that an advocacy point of mine, of like that this is, the lived experience researchers don't just appear out of nowhere. And when we're talking about an increase in peer workers and other lived experience positions, researchers, policy advocates, whatever it might be, also need to be part of that picture. Beyond that, the only kind of practical step I have is just really building those networks with researchers that you have, and finding contracting approaches that give you flexibility to just take people on for shorter periods of time for individual projects. But as I say, there isn't really a silver bullet to that one, because it is a kind of systemic problem, and I empathize, even though that's not a particularly helpful answer.
Yeah. The pace of change is often far too slow for my liking, and I guess for people's liking at best. Sometimes we just get incremental changes, and I mean, I know we've had multiple conversations, colleagues and so forth, around sort of managing people's expectations.
Yeah.
And I mean, we only recently had a session last night where one of the people who attended the session, she was talking about, whether she felt that she could participate in a particular initiative because she thought, is this the best way that she can contribute? We often feel, I often feel we're stuck in the middle. I mean, we actually know what needs to change. I mean, the discussions have been had for decades, right? Yeah. But for various reasons, they haven't been implemented. I guess part of it is about managing our expectations and frustrations around things not actually happening as quickly as we'd like.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing is just being transparent about those expectations. Like, I know, particularly after the Royal Commission in Victoria, I think there was a lot of hope that things were going to be done differently, because it was such a clear recommendation from that lived experience should be involved in every element of system design. And then I think that's not all eventuated in practice. And I feel like again, speaking to the Victorian example, what the Royal Commission showed was there's been a breakdown in trust between consumers and the system. And it replicates that breakdown of trust by saying we're going to do a new world where we do co-production and co-design on every project. And actually, I think you'd be you'd get a lot further by saying to consumers, look, we're not actually going to do co-design on this project, but we're going to tell you accurately what we actually are going to do. And I think just that kind of honesty and humility often goes a long way in being like, look, we all recognize we're not in a perfect world, and there's systems and workforce constraints and legal constraints and all of these things that make the work difficult. But again, going back to those kind of trauma-informed principles that I've mentioned a few times, they talk about honesty and transparency, and I think often that's something that's missing in some of the research that's done in the sector. But sounds like you're heading in the right direction, but experiencing a lot of the ongoing challenging hurdles. Yeah. Does anyone have any other questions, or we'll end on a slightly depressing, this is all good, but we're hamstrung by the system kind of note?
I guess if I can, if it's okay, I suppose I wanted to ask for your sense or your comment on where you think we are up to in terms of lived experience research. And I know that with our little team, we're about to, so aside from the project, we're about to try and write a little study, which has been about what the experience was like for all of us. Yeah, and the kind of building of those kinds of research models to talk about, as you say, what it is like, what the harms are or might be, and what the benefits are or might be. But yeah, just wanted to get your comment on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think we're in a vastly better place than we were when I started doing this work. Like, I think the first project, I've been working in research and policy for over a decade, but the first project where I actually was like, I am a lived experience researcher, I did in 2016 or 17. And my manager at the time was like, are you sure you want to share that? Like, do you think we'll win the work if that's something that you share? And now I'm in a place where that's actively being sought out as a skill that I bring to the research. So I think, like, even just reflecting on my own career, I've seen that huge difference in the way things are valued and it being something that's sought out. But I think what you say goes to what I think is the next gap, is we really don't have a lot of evidence or research about how you do this well beyond a lot of the anecdotal stuff. Now, I'm a qualitative researcher, so the anecdotal stuff is great. But I find that most of this has worked, you should try this stuff, is still held by individuals and sharing kind of through the grapevine of how research is done well. That sort of works because the mental health research grapevine in Australia is quite small. But I do think what's missing is like some really good grey literature, academic papers, whatever it is, that says this is what you do well, because this is how you do this well. Because what I've found is that people who are approaching this kind of thing for the first time want a checklist that they can pick up and they can go, okay, we do ABC and we've got it right. And I go, well, that's kind of the wrong approach, because you should be tailoring it every time to the community that you're working with, and like that's how you do it ethically, is actually to be flexible. But I think we do need something that's in the middle ground, that gives people enough of a steer that they develop the confidence that they then have the skills to be able to do this flexibly. And again, I think the frustrating thing with often the way research works is I've developed some of these toolkits for government departments and not-for-profits and that kind of thing, but they've then sat with those individual agencies and they're not shared publicly. And I think what's missing is that kind of public sharing of, we did this and it worked, but also we did this and it didn't work, and don't do that again. And really building that collective wisdom beyond the grapevine and things that we can share with people. The grapevine sharing works when you've got people like the people in this room who are interested enough to seek out resources. Where the gap is the people who are completely lost and don't even know how to begin. And I think they need more support. So please do that bit of work that you're doing and share what you find. Yeah, I'm working on a similar piece at the moment with this family violence project I'm doing, where majority of the team has lived experience, and working with the government department that's never approached work in this way. And we're really keen to showcase everything right down from like, how do you contract and commission in this way, not just how do you do interviews with people, because I think that bit's covered. It's the systemic, how do we contract, commission, sort out insurance, like all the boring stuff that needs to be worked out. Yeah,
That's great. Thanks so much, Jo.
Katie, I think might make sense to wrap up now given the time, but I guess the last thing I'd say is I love all of this stuff. I'm very happy to chat. I think Katie chucked my website in the chat, so please reach out. And yeah, if you need any support or have any questions about any projects, happy to chat.
Thank you so much, Jo. It's always a delight to hear you nerd out and hear the CMHDARN members nerd out. It's such a pleasure hearing people be passionate about research and ethics, and particularly the experiences of people with lived experience and trying to elevate their voice in this area. So thank you all for coming. I will be putting up the recording soon, and we'll send through an evaluation. So if you could please tell me how fantastic you thought Jo was, so that we can keep these kind of workshops running. That would be fantastic. And I'll plug the CMHDARN co-production Kickstarter as a good resource to support kind of elevating lived experience leadership in research as well. And we've got a co-design Kickstarter on the way in the next little while as well, which will help kind of provide that framework for real inclusive research. But we definitely acknowledge the frustrations of systemic barriers there. But thank you all for joining today. Appreciate you all, and you have a good afternoon. Thank you.